Frank Dalton sat in his dim kitchen with the lights off, the late afternoon sun slanting through yellowed blinds and casting long stripes across the table cluttered with unopened mail, pill bottles, and a plate from breakfast he hadn't bothered to rinse. In front of him sat two things he couldn't stop staring at, a foreclosure notice and a sealed envelope from his son, Kyle, postmarked 3 months ago. He hadn't opened it. He couldn't. Not yet. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, along with the low mumble of a news anchor on the TV in the other room. In today's tech headlines, she said brightly, Tesla CEO Elon Musk made a surprise announcement during a closed-door Q&A, hinting at a secret project that could, his words, disrupt the entire economy, using what he called the wisdom of the forgotten generation. Frank blinked and looked toward the screen, where grainy cell phone footage showed Musk pacing a small stage, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his voice calm but intense. People over 65, Musk said, are the most underestimated asset in the modern world. They have time, they have experience, and most importantly, they've survived failure. That's who I want helping shape what comes next. The camera panned to a confused crowd of investors and 20-somethings who didn't quite know how to react. Musk shrugged. Let them laugh. Disruption doesn't come from comfort zones. Frank scoffed under his breath. Yeah, sure. They don't mean people like me. He looked back down at the foreclosure notice. It was final. He had 60 days to vacate the house he and Marla had bought in 1985. Paid it off in 97. Then took out a second mortgage in 2018 to try and get through Marla's chemo. She died 6 months later. The debt didn't. Frank ran a hand through thinning gray hair and stood slowly, bones creaking like the floorboards under his slippers. He shuffled to the living room and turned up the TV just as the story ended. A new commercial came on, a smiling couple in their 30s laughing over coffee, buying a Tesla online in seconds. Frank picked up the remote, stared at it like it was a foreign object, then dropped it and walked out to the front porch. The summer heat pressed down like a wet towel. The neighborhood was quiet, like it always was now. When he moved here, every driveway had a car, every yard a kid or two riding bikes. Now it was mostly silence and overgrown grass. A for sale sign leaned crooked in the McKinney's lawn across the street. Frank lowered himself into the old porch swing and stared at the garage. The door was closed, faded blue paint peeling off like sunburnt skin. Behind it sat the '68 Mustang convertible he hadn't touched since Marla died. They used to cruise in it on Saturday mornings, coffee in thermoses, windows down even in winter. She always said the car had a soul. Frank hadn't heard it breathe in years. He leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him like radio static. Back when his hands were steady, his eyes sharp. When people brought their cars to Frankie the Fixer because they knew he could make engines purr and dashboard lights shut up for good. Back when Kyle would come home from college and they'd talk for hours in the garage, trading ideas, sketching out Frank's dream project on an oil-stained whiteboard, Project Thunderbolt. A gas-to-electric Mustang conversion kit for classic cars. They were going to patent it. Open a business together. Then time happened. Life happened. And Frank got old. The swing creaked. A mosquito buzzed near his ear. He didn't swat it. Just opened his eyes and stared at the garage again. Elon Musk wants old folks to help him change the economy, he muttered. He ever been to Flint? The memory of Marla's voice came uninvited, gentle but sharp. You were meant to build things, Frankie. You just forgot. That night, Frank microwaved a frozen meal, left half of it uneaten, and sat back down at his kitchen table. He picked up the envelope from Kyle, ran his thumb along the sealed edge, then dropped it again. He didn't need to open it. He knew it probably said, "Hope you're doing well, Dad," with some polite mention of a job or vacation or maybe a grandkid Frank had never met. He opened his old laptop instead, the one with the cracked hinge, and typed Elon Musk old people quote into the search bar. The top result was a grainy clip of the podcast from earlier. He clicked. There it was again. They've survived failure. That part stuck. Not succeeded. Survived failure. Frank sat with that thought like it was a hot coal in his hand. The world didn't want survivors anymore. It wanted disruptors. Influencers. Coders. Billionaire weirdos launching rockets and talking about Mars. And yet, Elon was saying survivors were exactly who he wanted. Frank clicked another video. This one was Musk talking about first principles, breaking problems down to their fundamentals. People think in analogies, Elon said. It's how we're taught. But if you want to really solve something, you break it down to its parts. Forget how it's always been done. Frank stared at the screen. That was how he used to think about cars. Not what the manual said, but what the machine was. What each part needed to do. Suddenly, he pushed back from the table and walked stiffly to the garage door. His hand hovered over the doorknob. The last time he'd turned it was the day after Marla died. He'd opened the garage, looked at the car, then closed it again. Told himself it didn't matter anymore. That night he slept in his recliner and dreamed of her voice, the way she used to say, "Everything can be fixed, Frankie. You just have to listen long enough." The next morning, Frank woke with a jolt and knew something had shifted. It was subtle, but it was real. He got dressed, put on his old work boots, and shuffled back to the garage door. He turned the knob and stepped into the stale darkness. Dust motes danced in the sunbeam from a side window. The Mustang sat like a forgotten altar, shrouded in a dirty canvas tarp. Frank approached slowly, like it might bite. He grabbed the corner of the tarp and pulled it back. The car was worse than he remembered. Rust on the rims. Tires flat. The once glossy red paint dulled to a lifeless burgundy. But it was still there. Still whole. Still his. He reached into the glove box and found the folder. The one labeled Project Thunderbolt. Inside were blueprints, sketches, notes, part numbers, everything he and Kyle had mapped out over dozens of long nights. It smelled like ink and dreams. Frank's hands shook slightly as he flipped through it. This was stupid. What was he going to do? Start building again? He was almost 70. His knees hurt. His back screamed if he bent too long. But then he remembered Musk's voice. If something's important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it. Frank didn't believe in much anymore, but he believed in engines. He believed in the sound of possibility. That night, he ordered a set of lithium-ion cells from a parts supplier he didn't know still existed. It maxed out one of his cards. He didn't care. Something had started. A rumble deep in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But movement. He printed Musk's quote and taped it to the garage wall. Then he sat in the driver's seat of the Mustang for the first time in over a decade, closed his eyes, and listened. The engine didn't purr. But something inside him did. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Dalton sat at the edge of his bed the next morning, lacing up his boots with fingers that didn't move quite like they used to, the ache in his knuckles sharp and familiar. Outside, the town of Larchwood was already humming with the sound of sprinklers and the occasional distant lawnmower, but Frank didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the calendar nailed to the closet door, a red circle drawn around a date from 7 years ago, Marla's last birthday. He hadn't crossed off a single day since. He used to be the kind of man who woke up with a list in his head and grease already under his fingernails. Back then, the garage was always full, cars lined up out front, neighbors dropping off old Chevys and pickups, needing everything from oil changes to full rebuilds. People came to Frank because he didn't just fix engines, he understood them. He'd run his fingers along the frame, listen to a rattle for 3 seconds, and say, "Loose tie rod. You're lucky it didn't snap on I-75. They'd shake their heads and call him a magician. He liked that. It made him feel solid, necessary. Then cars started getting too fancy, too computerized. Young guys with laptops replaced socket wrenches and torque specs. Suddenly Frank's magic wasn't magic anymore. He tried to adapt, bought a diagnostic scanner, watched videos online, but it wasn't the same. People stopped coming. One by one, the old customers either passed away or moved. The town shrank like a balloon with a pinhole. But the real unraveling started when Marla got sick. She'd been his compass, his home, his better mind. She was sharp and stubborn and never let him settle. When he said he'd missed his chance to do something big, she'd roll her eyes and say, "You're not dead yet, Frank. Build something." But when she got sick, he stopped building. Everything froze. He sold the tools he didn't need. The garage went quiet. After she passed, the days blended into each other. He'd wake up, take his pills, eat whatever frozen meal was closest, and sit on the porch like a forgotten statue. Kyle had called once every few months at first, always rushed, always talking about startups and algorithms. Then the calls stopped. Frank didn't blame him. Kyle had grown up watching his dad stuck in neutral. Why would he want to be reminded of that? He remembered one afternoon, maybe 10 years ago, when Kyle had come home for a weekend and sat with Frank in the garage. The sun was slanting through the open door, lighting up dust like tiny sparks, and they'd just finished sketching out a draft for Project Thunderbolt. Frank could still hear Kyle's voice, bright and hopeful. "If we nail this, Dad, we could retrofit 1,000 cars across the country. This could be huge." Frank had nodded but said nothing. He was already counting the reasons it wouldn't work. No money. No backers. Too old. Too late. Kyle had waited a beat, then added, "You always used to say the engine doesn't care how old you are. It just needs the right current." Frank had laughed at the time. Now he heard it like a warning he hadn't listened to. That day had been the last time they worked on the car together. Kyle left the next morning for California. Said he'd call when he got there. Frank never knew if he did. He couldn't remember. That memory weighed heavy now as he stood in the garage again, a place frozen in time. Cobwebs hung like lace from the ceiling corners, the air thick with old oil and rust. The Mustang sat with its hood open like a wounded animal. Frank ran his hand over the frame and tried not to think about how steady his grip used to be. He pulled out the old blueprints again and laid them across the workbench. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in spots, but the dream was still there. Modular design. Bolt-on battery housings. Adjustable controller settings. It was ambitious. It was messy. It was him. He remembered staying up until 2 in the morning with Marla, her legs tucked under her on the couch as she typed out notes while he rambled ideas aloud. She believed in it. Believed in him. More than he ever did. That was what hurt the most. That he let her down by doing nothing. He flipped to a page marked Phase 2, Integration. The parts list included components that didn't even exist anymore, but he circled them anyway, pretending they did. He knew he didn't have the money, but something inside him wouldn't let him walk away this time. Not again. Not when it felt like he was finally hearing her voice whispering, "Move." He walked back inside the house and pulled the envelope from the drawer again. Kyle's letter. Still unopened. He slid a knife under the flap and unfolded it with hands that trembled more from fear than age. Inside, a single page. "Frank, hope this finds you okay. I saw something online that reminded me of you. A guy in his 60s converted an old Camaro to run on solar and took it cross-country. I remembered how you always said it wasn't about being the first to do it, just doing it right. I guess I just wanted to say, I get it now." All the hours you spent in that garage. I used to think you were hiding. But maybe you were dreaming. Anyway, if you ever get the Mustang running again, let me know. I'd like to take a ride. Kyle. Frank held the paper for a long time, trying to breathe past the lump in his throat. A ride. Just one ride. That's what it would take. He stood slowly and walked back to the garage. If Elon Musk thought old people still had something to give, maybe he wasn't entirely crazy. Frank didn't want to change the economy. He just wanted to change the ending. He opened his laptop again and started researching parts, conversion kits, battery mounts, controller units. He couldn't afford the fancy stuff, but maybe he didn't need to. He found forums full of DIYers and tinkerers, some older than him, all doing things he'd been told were impossible. He spent the next several hours reading, watching, sketching, until his eyes ached and his spine screamed for rest. But something was awake in him now, something that hadn't stirred in years. Possibility. The next morning, he made a pot of real coffee for the first time in months. Not the instant stuff. Real beans, ground and brewed. It tasted like life. He showered, shaved, even changed his shirt. At the diner, Jenny raised her eyebrows and said, "You clean up for a hot date, Frank?" He grinned and said, "Just decided I'm not dead yet." She poured him coffee without asking. "Well, don't go getting wild on me. You order anything besides eggs and bacon, I'm calling the cops." He laughed, really laughed, and it felt good. He told her, casually, that he was tinkering with the Mustang again. Her eyes lit up. "About damn time," she said. "That car's been crying in that garage for years." Word spread faster than he expected. By the end of the week, 2 neighbors had stopped by to say they were glad to see him back in the garage. One even offered an old inverter he wasn't using. Frank hadn't felt this connected to the town since Marla's funeral. He knew it would take months. Knew it might not even work. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't care about the odds. He cared about the process. He cared about waking up with something to build. Late one night, he sat in the Mustang's front seat with the door open, moonlight spilling through the trees, and listened to Marla's old cassette. Her voice, rich and low, sang through static. "Ain't no mountain high enough," it cracked and wavered, but he could still hear her smile in the notes. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm doing it, March." Finally. Somewhere deep in the house, the computer dinged with a new email. But Frank didn't move. He just sat there, surrounded by dust and dreams, with the blueprints on his lap and the night whispering that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late after all. The following week crawled by with the relentless stillness Frank had come to expect from late summers in Larchwood. The mornings were already cooling down, the kind of air that whispered of autumn just around the corner, but the afternoons still pressed hot and heavy like wet flannel. Frank rose earlier than usual now, sometimes before sunrise, sitting on the porch with a coffee cup that steamed against the morning fog and watching the sky change colors like someone slowly turning up the volume on an old radio. He liked the quiet, but it wasn't enough anymore. The Mustang waited in the garage like a question mark he couldn't stop answering. It still didn't run, of course. Most days he was lucky if he could get 1 or 2 parts cleaned or catalogued, and the battery cells he'd ordered hadn't arrived yet. But it gave him something to aim for, a reason to get out of bed. Still, the weight of time clung to him like dust. His knees barked after only 20 minutes on the concrete floor, his back seized if he leaned over too long, and the names on his phone, the ones in his contacts and the ones in his memories, seemed to blur and vanish faster every year. The town was no better. The diner where Jenny still smiled and served coffee had a new, "For lease" sign in the window next door, where the old bookstore used to be. Across the street, the barber shop was gone, replaced by a payday loan place with flickering neon signs. Even the high school looked tired, paint peeling around the windows, the parking lot mostly empty. One afternoon, Frank found himself at Dr. Carson's office for a checkup he'd been putting off for months. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old magazines, and the receptionist barely looked up from her screen. When he finally got called in, Carson gave him that look, the one that said, "I don't want to say this, but I have to." "Your heart's not what it used to be, Frank," he said, tapping the chart with one finger. "You need to take it easy. Stress, strain, even excitement, it's all riskier now." Frank smirked. "What do you want me to do, Doc? Sit around and wait for my warranty to run out?" Carson didn't laugh. "I want you to understand your limits. You're not 25 anymore." Frank stood slowly, joints popping like bubble wrap. "No, I'm not. But I'm not done yet, either." He left without scheduling the follow-up. That evening, back in the garage, he sat on an overturned milk crate with a rag in one hand and a rusted wrench in the other. The quote he'd taped to the wall stared back at him, "If something's important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it." Elon's voice echoed in his head, the way he'd said it, like it wasn't just about rockets or cars or billion-dollar bets. Maybe it was about any fight worth showing up for. But part of him still doubted. He could feel it in the space between his ribs, in the hollow ache that Marla's voice used to fill. He remembered her laugh, the way she used to stand in the garage doorway with a dish towel in her hands and say, "You're in your head again. Come dance with me before dinner burns." They used to dance to old Motown records right there on the concrete floor, oil stains and all. It had been their ritual. Now the record player was buried under boxes, the dishes were all microwave safe, and there was no one left to pull him out of his head. That night, the power flickered during a thunderstorm, and Frank lit a candle in the kitchen. He sat there listening to the wind rattle the windows and thought about Kyle, about the email he hadn't replied to yet. He opened his laptop, hesitated, then clicked compose. He stared at the blinking cursor for 10 minutes, typed a few lines, deleted them, tried again. Finally, he settled on, "You ever wonder if we gave up too soon, Dad?" He hit send before he could change his mind. The next morning, still no reply. He didn't expect one. At the diner, Jenny poured him coffee and slid him a cinnamon roll. "On the house," she said. "You've got that look like something might be about to happen." Frank raised an eyebrow. "I'm just trying not to fall apart." She smiled gently. "You've been trying not to fall apart for years. At least now you look like you're aiming for something." On the way home, he stopped at the parts store, one of the few still open, and asked if they had any deep cycle converters in stock. The kid behind the counter, maybe 21 with a neck tattoo and a nose ring, didn't even look up. "You're better off just Googling it," he said. "We don't really carry that old-school junk anymore." Frank didn't argue. Just walked out, got into his truck, and sat behind the wheel for a long time. That was the thing no one warned you about with getting older. It wasn't just the aches and the losses. It was the invisibility. People stopped seeing you. Stopped listening. You became background noise in your own life. He drove back to the garage and opened the doors wide, letting the sunlight flood in. He cleared off the bench, laid out the tools he still had, and made a list of what he needed. Not just parts, information. Designs, schematics, supplier contacts. The kind of knowledge he'd ignored for too long. That night, he signed up for an online forum called VoltVets, a community of hobbyist engineers and retired techs building DIY EV conversions. He introduced himself simply, name's Frank Dalton. 68 years old. Working on converting a 1968 Mustang. Used to fix cars for a living. Looking to learn before I run out of road. Within an hour, he had 5 replies. One guy in Oregon offered tips on custom brackets. A woman in Ohio sent him a link to her blog documenting her own '69 Firebird conversion. Another guy messaged him privately, asking if he'd be interested in beta testing a new inverter prototype. Frank stared at the screen, stunned. These weren't kids. These were men and women like him. 60s, 70s. Engineers. Tinkerers. Dreamers. Still building. Still trying. Maybe Musk had a point. Maybe there really was a forgotten army out there. That night he didn't listen to Marla's tape. He didn't sit quietly with memories. He stayed up past midnight reading, taking notes, and planning. And for the first time in a long while, the idea that no one cared didn't seem so true. Somewhere out there, other people were still pushing forward. Still creating. Still hearing that quiet call that said, just one more thing before the end. He didn't sleep much, but when he did, he dreamed he was back on the road, Mustang humming, Marla in the passenger seat, laughing as they turned the music up and let the world blur past in streaks of golden light. The next morning, as he opened the garage door again and stepped into the light, he said aloud, "Let's see what this old heart's still good for." Frank Dalton stood in the center of his garage, hands on his hips, a fine layer of dust clinging to his shirt, and stared at the mess in front of him like it was a battlefield. The Mustang, still lifeless, sat with its hood open and wires dangling like spilled intestines. The lithium-ion battery pack he ordered had finally arrived, and it was sitting in a crate beside him like a silent promise. He hadn't touched it yet. Wasn't sure if he was ready to. The thing looked like it had come from NASA, sleek, unfamiliar, expensive. He felt like a man trying to build a spaceship with stone tools. Still, there was a buzz in his chest that wouldn't quit, a kind of low-voltage hum that ran deeper than his heartbeat. That morning he'd woken up without the usual fog. No hesitation. No voices telling him he was too old, too tired, too late. Just the strange sense that something important had already begun. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days, unless you counted the forum folks. Every night he logged into VoltVets, and every night there were new messages, new ideas, new encouragement. They called him Wrenchman68 now, and one guy even made him a custom logo. A cartoon of Frank's face with sparks flying from a socket wrench. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he saved it to his desktop and said nothing. That's how things went now. Quiet progress. A screw tightened here. A bracket fabricated there. Frank had always believed in the power of physical work. You didn't talk about what you were going to build. You built it. You got your hands dirty. You let the process change you. He spent a full day mapping out the new battery position and another trying to make the brackets fit, swearing under his breath when nothing lined up and his back screamed in protest. He fell asleep in the recliner with his hand stained black and the blueprint still open on his lap. But the pain didn't bother him as much as it used to. It felt earned. The next morning brought something unexpected. An email from Kyle. Just the subject line, "Still working on the car," made Frank sit up straighter. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for nearly 5 minutes before he typed back, "Every day. You were right. The Mustang still got fight in it. So do I." He hit send and sat back, staring at the blinking cursor. The silence afterward felt heavy, but not hollow. It felt like space being made for something new. That afternoon, he went to the garage and stared at the crate again. The battery. The heart of it all. He opened it with a crowbar and peeled back the protective foam, revealing the glossy black casing beneath. His reflection stared back at him, older than he remembered, but not gone. Not irrelevant. He ran his fingers over the surface and whispered, "All right, let's see what you've got." Installation wasn't easy. Nothing about this kind of retrofit was. You had to strip the soul of the car out, piece by piece, and replace it with something that didn't belong, but somehow had to. He started with the mounting. Measured twice. Drilled once. Adjusted. Measured again. By the time the battery was bolted in, it was nearly midnight, and the garage floor was littered with tools, wrenches, and open manuals. Frank sat in the driver's seat with the door open, sweat soaking through his shirt, hands trembling from the hours of strain, and looked out at the stars through the open garage. "Mar," he said softly, "I don't know if I'm doing this right. But I'm doing it." The next day brought another wave of problems. The controller wouldn't communicate with the throttle system. The wiring diagram from 2007 didn't match the parts he had. At one point, smoke puffed out from the junction box, and Frank slammed the kill switch just in time. He sat there coughing, staring at the melted wire casing, and said aloud, "Maybe Carson was right. Maybe I should slow down." But then he remembered Musk's quote, "Survivors of failure. Not avoiders. Not quitters. Survivors." So he got up. He rewired the junction. He rewatched the video tutorials. He messaged a guy on VoltVets named Edison Larry who'd done something similar last year, and within an hour, Larry had sent back a custom diagram with handwritten notes. Frank printed it out and taped it to the wall next to Musk's quote. The community was real. And they weren't just tech guys and retirees. They were believers. Quiet revolutionaries with soldering irons and grit. By Friday, the motor was wired. The controller was calibrated. The battery was charged. The Mustang still looked half dead, the body rusted and the tires sagging, but underneath, something had shifted. Frank stood there staring at it, unsure what to feel. It was no longer a relic. It was a question waiting for an answer. He decided to try a systems check. Just diagnostics. No movement yet. He flipped the main breaker, held his breath, and pressed the starter button he'd wired into the dashboard. For a second, nothing. Then the soft whine of the motor kicking on. Not the roar he was used to. No gasoline. No combustion. Just a whisper. A hum. The sound of something starting. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with awe. He laughed, the sound ragged and surprised. "You hear that, Mar?" he said into the empty garage. "She's breathing again." He sat in the car until the sun dipped below the trees and the crickets came out. For a moment, he imagined himself 10 years younger, Kyle in the passenger seat, Marla behind the camera laughing as they revved the old engine for the first time. He imagined roads ahead, highways unwinding into possibility. He hadn't felt that in years. Later that night, he posted an update on VoltVets. He didn't say much, just, "Motor test successful. First breath in 14 years. Thanks, team." Within an hour, there were over 30 replies. GIFs, emojis, one guy saying he was crying a little. Someone even tagged Elon Musk's official account with a screenshot of Frank's build. Frank stared at the tag. Elon Musk. The man who'd sparked all this. The man who'd said old people were the most underestimated asset in the world. Frank didn't expect a reply. Didn't care if one came. Just knowing someone, somewhere, thought he still had value, that was enough. He shut off the garage light, closed the laptop, and stood in the kitchen sipping a glass of water. His hands were still greasy. His back was still sore. But something had changed. The project wasn't a project anymore. It was a declaration. A refusal. A comeback. He didn't need to prove anything to the world. But maybe he needed to prove something to himself. That the story wasn't over. That you could still start the engine after sitting in neutral for years. That even after the love of your life is gone and your dreams are buried under bills and loss and silence, you could still dig them out. Still breathe life back into something. Still create. Still change. Somewhere deep in the quiet house, the record player crackled to life on its own. He must have bumped the switch earlier. A familiar tune drifted into the kitchen. Ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough. He smiled. And for once, he didn't feel like a man clinging to the past. He felt like a man preparing for the road ahead. 3 days later, Frank Dalton wheeled the Mustang out of the garage for the first time in almost a decade. It didn't move under its own power, he had to push it by hand, inch by inch, knees locking up every few feet and sweat pouring down his temples, but it was out in the sunlight again. The driveway shimmered in the heat, and the cicadas buzzed like tiny engines. Frank leaned on the hood when it was finally clear of the garage and just breathed, chest heaving, legs weak but steady. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. A few more "for sale" signs, a few more overgrown lawns, but the bones were the same. He used to know everyone on this block by name. Now he knew half, maybe less. But he didn't care about that right now. All he cared about was what came next. He turned back toward the Mustang, now half alive with its electric heart, and wiped his hands on an old rag. Time for the test. It wasn't going to be a joyride. The suspension was still shot, the frame needed reinforcement, and the tires were barely holding pressure. But the system was live. The battery held its charge. The diagnostics read clear. It was time to find out if this thing would move. He climbed in slowly, wincing as his knees folded into the seat. He'd rebuilt the pedal assembly himself, rewired the accelerator and brake to communicate with the controller. His hands hovered over the dash for a second, then he flipped the main switch. A soft click, a hum, and the dash lit up like a spaceship. Not bad for a 68-year-old and a handful of borrowed schematics. He gripped the wheel, pressed the accelerator gently. Nothing. He frowned, double-checked the gear selector. Forward mode was engaged. He pressed again. A lurch. A low whine. The wheels rolled, just a foot, maybe two, but it moved. Frank exhaled like he hadn't breathed in years. "You stubborn old girl," he muttered. "You're still in it." The Mustang rolled forward another few feet, slow and steady, the hum of the electric motor rising in pitch. It wasn't fast. It wasn't smooth. But it was real. It was happening. He guided it to the end of the driveway, where the pavement met the road, and stopped. Cars rolled by now and then. A mail truck. A teenager on a scooter. Nobody noticed the old man behind the wheel of the half-restored relic. And that was fine. This wasn't about being seen. It was about the doing. About proving, even if only to himself, that there was still gas in the tank, metaphorically, anyway. He sat there for a long time, looking down the quiet street, wondering what it would feel like to keep going. Turn left. Hit the highway. Let the hum of progress drown out everything else. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. He reversed slowly, more of a crawl than a roll, and parked the Mustang back in front of the garage. One test. That's all he needed today. He killed the power and stepped out, his legs trembling with a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. Back inside, he opened his laptop, posted the update on VoltVets. She moved. Not far. Not fast. But she moved. The replies came in quickly. Cheers. GIFs. One guy said, "You just changed the weather, brother." Frank smiled, the first real smile in days. But one message stood out from the rest. From a user named nextphase_Altair. The message was short. "Are you Frank Dalton from Larchwood, Michigan? If so, I need to speak with you directly. It's about something bigger." Frank stared at the screen, frowning. The username didn't ring a bell. He clicked on the profile, nothing but a generic avatar and a blank bio. He hesitated, then typed back, "Yes." "Who are you?" The reply came a few minutes later. "We've been watching this project. It aligns with something we're developing. Do you have time for a call?" Frank rubbed his chin, heart ticking faster. This felt different. Not a fan message. Not a fellow tinkerer. Something else. He typed back, "What kind of project?" The reply, "Confidential, for now." But let's just say you've revived something we thought was lost. Call me. A phone number followed. Frank didn't recognize the area code. He stared at it for a long time. This could be a scam. A prank. Someone messing around. But something about the tone was real. Professional. Sharp. He picked up the landline, still had one, because he never fully trusted cell phones, and punched in the number. It rang twice. Then a voice. Calm. Male. Maybe late 30s. Frank Dalton. Yeah. Who's this? Call me Elliot. I work with a team in Austin. We've been developing open-source electric vehicle platforms for modular retrofits. You just popped up on our radar because of the battery configuration you're using. It matches a prototype we shelved 5 years ago. Frank blinked. You're saying you built this same setup? Not quite. We conceptualized it. Never completed the testing phase. Your design, it works. It's crude, but it works. And that's important. Frank leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly feeling like he was floating. Why does that matter to you? Because we just secured funding to launch a decentralized vehicle retrofit initiative. Community-led. Veteran engineers. Retirees. DIYers. The forgotten workforce. Sound familiar? Frank said nothing. His heart was thudding in his ears. Elliot continued, we've already partnered with a group out west. But we need regional leads. People who can train others. Build locally. We want to show the world that the next automotive revolution won't come from factories. It'll come from garages like yours. Frank couldn't speak. Could barely think. Elliot pressed on, voice calm but urgent. We'll fly someone out. Evaluate your system. Help refine it. If it passes stress testing, we bring you on. Full-time or part-time. Your call. We're not looking for resumes, Frank. We're looking for people who've been told they're done, and aren't. Frank whispered, why me? Because no one else built what you built. And because the economy is about to change. You're already ahead of the curve. You just don't know it yet. The call ended with a promise to follow up within 72 hours. Frank hung up the phone and sat down, stunned. This couldn't be real. He'd spent the last year feeling like an old piece of furniture, unneeded, too heavy, too worn. Now someone was telling him he'd accidentally stepped into a movement. That his lonely little garage project might be part of something bigger. That night, he didn't eat. Didn't sleep. He just walked out to the garage and stared at the Mustang for hours. Ran his fingers along the hood. Opened the schematics. Adjusted the controller mount. Cleaned the wiring harness. He wasn't just fixing a car anymore. He was walking into something new. He could feel it, deep in his bones. A shift. A pull. The sound of something much larger humming just beyond the horizon. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Frank Dalton didn't feel old. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something that might just matter. 2 days passed and Frank Dalton barely slept, eating in fragments, drinking too much coffee, and checking his email every 20 minutes as if willing something, anything, to appear. He reread Elliot's message a dozen times, memorized the name of the initiative, Altair Retrofit Labs, and kept rehearsing in his head what he'd say when they followed up. But nothing came. No call. No update. Just silence. On the third morning, Frank stood in the garage, arms crossed, watching a thin drizzle with the driveway while the Mustang sat quiet, as if holding its breath. The old vinyl record player still sat in the corner, covered in dust. The same one he and Marla had danced to, the one she'd insisted on keeping long after CDs and MP3s made it obsolete. He stared at it now like it was a memory locked inside a glass case. With a quiet grunt, he walked over, wiped the surface clean with a rag, and flipped the power switch. It took a moment, but the platter began to spin, slow and crackling. He dropped the needle, and out came the warm, imperfect voice of Marvin Gaye singing Inner City Blues. Frank closed his eyes and let the sound fill the garage, a soft pulse under the smell of old oil and fresh circuitry. This wasn't nostalgia. It was grounding. It reminded him that the past didn't have to trap you, it could anchor you just enough to leap forward. That afternoon, the email finally arrived. Subject line, next step, confirming evaluation date. Frank opened it with fingers that trembled. Elliot's tone was all business, efficient, respectful, but urgent. A senior technical advisor will arrive Friday at 9 a.m. local time. Her name is Dr. Janine Keller. Please have the vehicle accessible for full inspection. This isn't a test of polish, it's a test of potential. Also, Elon has been made aware of the project threads on VoltVets. He's asked to be kept updated on your build specifically. Proceed accordingly. Frank read the last line 3 times. Elon. The Elon Musk. The man who once said, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Now that same man was watching him. Watching this. It felt impossible, surreal, absurd, and yet something inside him settled, like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Not because he worshipped Elon, not because of the fame or money or headlines. But because Musk had become something more than a man. He was an idea. A force. A permission slip for people like Frank to dream big again. At 70, Elon was still charging into industries people half his age wouldn't dare touch. Space, tunneling under cities, building humanoid robots, launching fleets of autonomous taxis. Always forward. Always faster. Frank wasn't trying to be him. But he was finally allowing himself to be like him, in mindset, in risk, in refusing to stay parked in place. Friday came fast. Too fast. Frank was up before the sun, running checks on every component he could. He didn't know what to expect. Dr. Janine Keller. The name meant nothing to him. He imagined a lab coat, thick glasses, some government scientist with a clipboard and no patience for an old man's mess. When the knock came at precisely 8:59, he opened the door to find a tall, fit woman in her mid-50s wearing jeans, boots, and a zippered field jacket with the Altair logo embroidered on the breast. Her hair was streaked silver and tied back, her face calm but sharp, eyes scanning everything. Mr. Dalton? Yeah. You Keller? Dr. Keller, but yes. May I come in? She stepped inside without waiting for a reply, eyes immediately locking onto the Mustang through the garage windows. That the build? That's her. She walked straight into the garage and circled the vehicle like a hawk, pulling a tablet from her coat, running her fingertips across the hood, crouching to inspect the underside. Age of frame? 68 original, reinforced. Motor? 72-volt AC induction. Coupled to the original drivetrain with a custom adapter plate I machined myself. Battery source? Lithium-ion pack, modular. Wired for expansion. Safety fails. 3-tier cutoff. Manual, digital, and emergency brake override. She nodded once. Show me the wiring. For the next 2 hours, Frank walked her through every connection, every adaptation, every mistake he'd corrected and every stubborn little choice he'd made. She said very little, just tapped notes into her tablet and asked precise, technical questions. He hadn't talked this much since Marla died. By the end, he was hoarse and sweating. She stood back, arms crossed, and said simply, "It's rough." Frank braced himself. But it works. And that matters more than polish. She looked him in the eye. Do you know how many engineers your age are still building? Not many, I guess. Hardly any. You're not a fluke, Frank. You're a proof of concept. She stepped forward and handed him a slim envelope. This is a non-disclosure agreement. Sign it, and we start phase 2. That includes funding, access to our proprietary toolkit, and mentorship for others in your region. You become our pilot site for a Midwestern retrofit lab. Frank stared at the envelope, heartbeat pounding. And Elon gets a report. Every Friday. He's tracking all pilot nodes personally. He's invested. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Frank signed. Just like that, the garage changed. Within a week, parts started arriving, high-efficiency converters, 3D printed housings, custom software modules. Janine stayed for 2 days, then returned to Austin, leaving behind a contact network and a remote assistant. Frank's phone rang more in that first week than it had all year. Calls from other pilot members. Calls from younger engineers volunteering to help. Calls from people asking if they could learn from him. One man drove in from Detroit just to shake Frank's hand. Another sent a video of his own retrofit build in Alabama, inspired directly by Frank's forum posts. Frank was overwhelmed. Humbled. But energized in a way he didn't understand. Every morning now had purpose. Every evening had momentum. The Mustang was no longer the goal. It was the start. He created a new whiteboard in the garage titled Ripple Effects. On it, he listed every person he'd helped, every tool he'd shared, every lesson he could document. He'd thought legacy was about what you leave behind. But now he saw it differently. Legacy was what you set in motion, what continues long after you're gone. And somewhere out there, Elon Musk was watching. Not as a god or savior, but as a symbol. A spark. A reminder that boldness wasn't reserved for the young. That disruption wasn't limited to startups. That some revolutions begin in garages, with oil-stained notebooks, humming motors, and people who simply refuse to give up. Frank stood in the garage that night, lights off, Mustang glowing faintly under a single hanging bulb, and whispered into the quiet, "It's not too late." It was never too late. And somewhere, if only in his imagination, he heard Elon's voice reply, "It never is." Frank Dalton had just begun to believe he was part of something larger when the knock came again, this time unexpected, this time quieter. It was just after 7 in the evening, the garage humming with life, the Mustang's new housing for the thermal regulation system half assembled on the bench. He wiped his hands, walked to the front door, and pulled it open to find a face he hadn't seen in over 2 years. Kyle. His son. Older, leaner than Frank remembered, his hair cropped short and his jaw shadowed with stubble, dressed in jeans and a windbreaker, a duffel bag hanging from his shoulder. No words at first. Just silence. Then Kyle nodded once and said, "Heard you brought the Mustang back to life." Frank's heart thundered, the air knocked from his chest like he'd taken a hit. He stood frozen for a moment, lips parted, unsure if he was imagining this. "You drove all the way here just for the car?" Kyle gave a half smile. "Not just the car." Frank stepped aside. "Come in." It was the same house, the same smell of old wood and strong coffee, but now there was a blueprint rolled out on the kitchen table, pages of wiring specs scattered like a puzzle mid-solve, and a laptop open to a chat thread labeled Altair Core Midwest. Kyle set the bag down, glanced at the plans, then looked back at his father. "So what's going on here, Dad?" "I saw the forum post. Saw the responses. Then I saw your name on a community innovation map shared by, well, someone on X tagged Elon directly." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're on X now?" Kyle shrugged. "Had to be. Part of my job. Data architecture for a micromobility startup in Chicago. We're always tracking disruptive tech threads. When your name popped up, I didn't believe it at first." Frank moved slowly to the table, tapping one finger on the Mustang's diagram. I didn't believe it either. Then one day I realized nobody was going to save me. So I saved myself. Kyle didn't sit. He walked the room, eyes darting to the framed photos on the wall, the one of Marla in her garden, the old black and white of Frank and Kyle at a Tigers game in the 90s, and finally the printout taped above the workbench, Elon's quote in thick Sharpie, "If it's important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it." Kyle's voice was quieter now. "I used to think you'd stop trying. After Mom passed, you just disappeared." Frank nodded. "I did. You were right. I let grief turn into inertia. Then I convinced myself it was too late to change anything. And now?" Frank smiled, the kind that didn't come easy. "Now I know better." They stood in that thick silence again, father and son, not trying to fix everything at once, but not ignoring it either. It was Kyle who finally broke it. "I want to help." Frank blinked. "With the car? With the project? With everything?" "I've been designing modular software for scooter fleets, predictive maintenance, battery optimization, load balancing. This is a chance to work on something that actually means something." Frank let the words sink in. He wasn't sure whether to hug him or hand him a wrench. He did neither. Just nodded. "Then let's get to work." The next morning, they opened the garage together. Frank had always thought the Mustang would be the centerpiece of this journey. But now it was clear, it was just the entry point. The real revolution was about the people coming after him. And Kyle was the first follower. They spent hours going through the vehicle's telemetry system, Kyle refining the interface, building out a modular dashboard that could adapt to various conversion models. He talked excitedly about how retirees across the country could use this system to retrofit vehicles using open-source templates, how Frank's garage could become a node, a seed planted in the soil of a rusting economy. Frank mostly listened, occasionally nodding, sometimes asking questions he'd never have known to ask just a month ago. He felt something shifting. Not just in his bones, but in the air around them. This wasn't about his son watching him build something. It was about building something together. And that changed everything. On Thursday, Janine Keller called to check in. Frank handed the phone to Kyle, who briefed her on the new firmware overlay he'd designed. After 5 minutes, she interrupted him and said, "Wait, are you Frank's son?" Kyle smirked. "Last I checked." Then this just got a whole lot more interesting. Within an hour, Elliot emailed them an official proposal: onboard Kyle as a technical collaborator for the Midwest pilot site. Provide him with access credentials. Give him a seat at the virtual table. Frank felt like his chest might burst. It was more than pride. It was healing. He didn't know this version of his son, but he liked him. More than that, he respected him. And maybe, just maybe, Kyle was beginning to see Frank not as an old man stuck in neutral, but as someone worth following. They kept working, kept refining, until the Mustang was more than a test car. It was a blueprint. A beacon. Kyle installed a data logger and linked it to the cloud. "We're live streaming the metrics," he said. "Every charge cycle, every trip you take from here on out, it'll be public. Transparent. People need to see this in motion." Frank nodded. "Then I guess I better start driving again." That night, after dinner, Kyle pulled out his phone and opened an app. There's a SpaceX talk streaming. Elon's doing a Q&A about decentralized tech. They sat at the kitchen table, screen glowing between them. Elon stood on a stage in Texas, flanked by rocket prototypes, talking about how people underestimated grassroots engineering. "We're too quick to dismiss experience," he said. "We have an entire generation of builders sitting idle, not because they're useless, but because no one's asked them the right questions." Frank watched, silent, a lump rising in his throat. Elon paused, then added, "You know who's dangerous? A guy who knows how to weld, troubleshoot analog systems, and learn new tech at 68. That's the person I want leading the next wave. Kyle turned slowly toward his father. He's talking about you, isn't he? Frank didn't reply. He didn't need to. The next morning, they rolled the Mustang down the driveway again. This time, Frank got behind the wheel. Kyle stood beside him, filming with a drone tethered to his phone. You ready? Kyle asked. Frank tightened his grip on the steering wheel. I've been ready. I just forgot for a while. The Mustang whirred to life. Silent. Powerful. Electric. It glided forward, smooth and steady, down the street. Kyle whooped from behind the camera, laughter echoing through the neighborhood. A few kids looked up from their bikes. A neighbor waved. The car turned the corner and disappeared out of sight. A minute later it came back, headlights blinking, the motor humming like a song from the future. Frank rolled into the driveway and shut it down. That's one, he said. 1 mile? Kyle asked. No, Frank replied. One beginning. Within days of the Mustang's first public test run, the footage Kyle posted online began to ripple far wider than either of them expected. What started as a 60-second clip titled, "My Dad Just Converted His 1968 Mustang to Electric at 68 Years Old," spread across platforms like wildfire. It wasn't flashy, just Frank behind the wheel, calm, focused, proud, but that's what made it work. The video didn't scream for attention. It spoke softly and carried weight. It whispered to people who thought their time had passed. It reached veterans in Ohio, retired mechanics in Montana, widowed grandmothers who once dreamed of fixing engines with their husbands. Within 48 hours, the clip had over 2 million views. Then 5. Then 10. Comments flooded in like a tidal wave. This made me cry. I thought my hands were too shaky to build again. My dad's been depressed since retiring. I'm showing him this. Elon needs to see this. Wait, is he already watching? Frank didn't know how to process it. He'd spent years being invisible. Now people around the world were calling him the electric grandpa, tagging him in projects, asking for advice, even offering to fly in to learn from him. Local reporters showed up. A podcast requested an interview. An energy startup from Denmark reached out asking for collaboration. At first, it was overwhelming. Frank had to ask Kyle to help sort the requests, to respond to what mattered and let the noise go. They added a sign to the garage door, Midwest Retrofit Node Number 001, Altair Labs. Janine sent a shipment of tools and camera gear. You're not just building now, she told them. You're teaching. This is the new classroom. Frank felt the shift in his bones. It wasn't about one Mustang anymore. It was about momentum. Kyle suggested launching weekly live streams, Retrofit Fridays with Frank. The name was a joke at first, but the first stream had over 30,000 viewers. By the third week, it had a sponsor. And that's when the garage truly went global. A woman from New Zealand wrote, "My father cried watching this. He's starting his first build next week." A group in Ghana requested the battery schematics. A retired electrical engineer in Arizona built a home rig based on Frank's design and emailed, "Your wiring diagram just shaved 2 years off my learning curve." The map on the garage wall started filling with red pins, every location where someone launched a retrofit inspired by Frank's build. They called it the Musk map, half joking, half serious. It was less about Elon personally, more about what he represented. Disruption. Boldness. Refusing to wait for permission. Frank finally understood something he'd only glimpsed before: Elon wasn't the finish line. He was the ignition spark. The story wasn't Elon Musk builds the future. The story was Elon Musk showed us we could, too. And now, Frank was part of that fire. But momentum, like energy, had to be managed. There were growing pains. One night, Frank stayed up too late reviewing a batch of submissions from people asking to partner. Kyle tried to get him to rest. "Dad, you don't have to answer everyone." But Frank shook his head. "They waited too long to be seen. I know what that feels like." Still, the pace wore on him. His hands ached more now. His back locked up some mornings. He wouldn't admit it, but Kyle saw the signs. That's when the knock came again, soft, careful, unfamiliar. Frank opened the door and found a young man in his early 20s, wide-eyed, thin, with a notebook clutched in one hand and a canvas satchel over his shoulder. "Hi. My name's Elijah. I came to help." Frank blinked. "You what?" "I'm a tech apprentice from the Kansas City Altair node. They said you needed someone to manage community ops. I already do content archiving, database tagging, project intake. I can set up automated responses for your inbox. You shouldn't be doing this alone." Kyle glanced at his father, then back at the young man. "Did they send you officially?" Elijah nodded. "Dr. Keller signed off. I'm one of 3 rotating interns. We're being assigned to pilot sites that go viral." Frank wasn't used to accepting help. But something about the kid's calm urgency, his quiet confidence, felt familiar. Maybe because it reminded him of himself, before the world started ignoring him. "All right," Frank said. "Come in." Within a week, Elijah had transformed the back end of the operation. All the forum posts were categorized. Emails were triaged. Schematics were versioned and cross-linked. Requests were filtered by region and expertise. Suddenly, Frank had time to breathe again. Time to think. And he used that time to dream bigger. "What if," he asked Kyle one night, "we didn't just respond to people online? What if we invited them here?" Kyle looked up from his laptop. "Like a training camp?" "More like a summit. A gathering. People from all over, coming to build, learn, eat, talk. Share their projects. A garage full of builders, from 18 to 80. Kyle nodded slowly. "I like it. We'll call it Spark Camp." They set a date, 6 weeks out. They didn't know how many would come. They didn't care. Even 5 people would be enough. But when they posted the invite, Spark Camp, Learn. Build. Disrupt. They got over 700 responses in 3 days. Janine called again. "We'll help with logistics. But this is your event, Frank." You lit the fire. For the first time, Frank felt something deeper than pride. It was legacy, yes, but it was also belonging. He wasn't leading from behind anymore. He was right at the center. The garage wasn't just where he fixed things now. It was where futures got rewired. Where lives recharged. He stood there one morning, staring at the Mustang, remembering how all this began. One man. One broken dream. One spark. Now the world was watching. But more importantly, the world was joining in. The secret Elon Musk project wasn't a corporate endeavor. It wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was people, everyday people, rediscovering their power to build, to shape, to start again. Frank whispered, "This is bigger than all of us." And for the first time in years, he felt small in the best way. Not forgotten. Not useless. Just one thread in a massive, growing web of hope. It started with one folding chair in the driveway. Frank set it out at 6 in the morning, long before the sun burned off the dew, and stared at it like it was some kind of monument. Just a simple metal chair, scuffed from years of use, but it marked a moment he never imagined he'd live to see. Spark Camp was real. People were coming. And not just people. Builders, doers, retirees, rookies, inventors, dreamers who had been watching, waiting, quietly holding on to something inside them they hadn't dared speak aloud until now. By 8 o'clock, the quiet street that had barely seen visitors in years was lined with vehicles of all kinds: electric trucks, homemade trailers, a few dusty minivans with bumper stickers like "My other car is solar." Neighbors peeked through curtains, jaws slack as one after another, the attendees stepped out carrying toolboxes, laptops, fold-out tables, even full battery arrays. Janine had arrived the night before with a small support team and had turned the side yard into a makeshift command center, complete with tents, a media kiosk, and folding tables stacked with Altair badges, solar chargers, and thermal flasks branded with "Spark Camp 001, Disrupt the Rust." Kyle was everywhere, checking in guests, syncing devices, assigning build zones in the garage and driveway. Elijah managed the live feed, directing a dozen live streams across platforms with the kind of calm intensity Frank associated with air traffic controllers. And Frank? Frank just stood there for a minute, soaking it all in, hands in the pockets of his denim jacket, trying to process the impossible truth. All of this was happening because he chose not to stop. The first handshake of the day came from a woman named Ruth, 74, from Duluth, Minnesota. She'd been a mechanic's apprentice in the 70s, then raised 3 kids, cared for her dying husband, and now lived alone with a barn full of tools and time. "Your Mustang made me feel like I was allowed to try again," she said. "So I pulled the tarp off my old Chevy. Let's see if we can make her hum again." Next came Donnell from Baltimore, 62, who had retrofitted an old city bus into a mobile maker lab. "People treat us like we're obsolete," he said, eyes shining. "But this is the revolution I've been waiting for." Frank shook hands until his knuckles ached. They came in waves: 3 brothers from Kansas with matching jumpsuits and a solar generator, a retired Air Force avionics tech from Nevada who brought a set of lithium modules he'd custom-built in his garage, a former Ford engineer who left the industry after they phased out his division and now wanted to train the next generation before the lights go out on us. And the lights weren't going out, not today. The garage glowed with energy, literal and emotional, as tools buzzed, screens lit up, and every corner of the yard became a workshop. There were people teaching others how to rewire dashboards, mount cooling systems, fabricate adapter plates. Someone started printing custom Altair logo badges on a portable 3D printer. A woman named Beth, 68, from Sacramento ran a soldering workshop under the oak tree, teaching a group of teens and gray-haired veterans side by side. By noon, Frank felt something in his chest shift, not fear, not nerves, but a swell of emotion so big he had to sit down. He found that old folding chair again, parked himself by the garage, and just watched. For a long while, he said nothing. Then someone tapped his shoulder. "You're trending again," Elijah said, showing him a tablet screen. Frank squinted. It was Elon. Not a video. A repost. Elon had shared a photo someone took of Frank sitting in that chair, surrounded by working people, hands dirty, smiling in the middle of a movement. Elon's comment was short: "This is how it starts. Real builders. Real future." Below that, the post had 500,000 likes. Frank chuckled under his breath. "I guess I better keep sitting in this chair if it makes headlines." Elijah smiled. "You do what you need to. The world's watching." But Frank didn't care about the world right now. He cared about the man in front of him, Kyle, who had just walked over with a circuit board in one hand and a question in his eyes. "Hey, Dad. We've got a compatibility issue with the inverter on Ruth's build. Mind taking a look?" Frank rose without hesitation. "Lead the way." They worked side by side for the next hour, solving the problem not with brute force or speed but with patience, laughter, shared stories, and the quiet rhythm of problem solving that only comes when ego steps aside. Ruth watched them with a grin. "You two ought to go on tour. Like the Car Whisperers." Frank laughed. "Only if the bus is electric." There was food, too. Someone brought sandwiches. A local food truck pulled up and started serving tacos for free, sponsored by a local hardware store that wanted to support the spark. No one took advantage. People paid if they could. Some bartered tools for lunch. Others just said thank you and got back to work. This wasn't a tech conference. It wasn't a startup event. It was something purer. Something older. A gathering of hands and hearts and hope. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the rows of workbenches and vehicles in progress, someone wheeled a Bluetooth speaker into the middle of the yard and played an old Motown song. Marvin Gaye again. Frank smiled. People started swaying. Some danced. Some kept working, heads nodding to the rhythm. And in the middle of it all stood Frank Dalton, no longer a man wondering if his time had passed, but a man fully immersed in the flow of what came next. Janine walked over, sipping coffee from a thermal mug. You know, this was supposed to be a test, right? A proof of concept. But now it's something else. You made it something else. Frank looked around. I didn't make anything. I just opened the door. That's all it takes, she said. The right door. At the right time. That night, after the campfire had burned low and the last drone had landed, Frank sat under the stars with Kyle and Elijah, just listening to the hum of distant crickets and the occasional soft clink of tools being packed away. What do we do now? Kyle asked. Do we scale? Do we launch more nodes? Frank thought for a long time. We keep the heart in it, he said. That's what matters. We make sure this never becomes just about tech. It's about people who thought they were too old to matter, and showing them they still do. Elijah nodded slowly. That's what scared the big guys. Not the batteries. The belief. Frank looked up at the sky, saw a faint trail. A satellite, maybe Starlink, moving silently across the stars. He smiled. Somewhere out there, Elon was still launching things into the heavens. But down here, in a small Michigan garage, another kind of launch had happened. A quieter one. A deeper one. A launch of people. The forgotten. The retired. The dismissed. Rising again, not in protest, but in power. And it had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning after Spark Camp's final day was strangely quiet. The cars had packed up, the tools were stored, the tents folded away. Frank stood in the garage doorway and felt an emptiness settle where the buzz of activity had just been. For a moment, the silence felt like a whisper from the past, the old doubts returning with sharper voices. Are you really making a difference, or just fooling yourself? Is this just a momentary spark or a lasting fire? The voices were familiar, the same ones that had chased him for years, the fear that he was too late, too slow, too worn out to truly change anything. He rubbed his hands on his jeans, feeling the grit from the build still clinging to his skin, and then he saw Kyle walking up behind him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Morning, Kyle said softly. You look like you wrestled with ghosts overnight. Frank took a mug, sipped, then exhaled. I did. After all that energy, it's weird to be quiet again. Kyle nodded. I get it. It's like after a big family reunion, then everyone leaves and the house feels empty. Frank smiled faintly. Exactly. And with family, you don't question if you belong. But here, sometimes I wonder if we're just a flash in the pan. Kyle sat down on the old workbench. You remember what Elon said in that interview? When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank looked up, the quote landing like a pebble in a still pond. Yeah. But what if the odds catch up with you? Then you keep going. Because giving up guarantees failure. That's the difference. Frank looked out at the empty yard and thought about the hundreds who had come, the stories he'd heard, the connections forged. Were those moments enough? Did they change anything bigger? That's when his phone buzzed. A message from Janine, urgent, we need to talk about the latest battery test results. Frank's heart sank. Over the last week, Altair Labs had been pushing forward with prototypes based on Frank's Mustang retrofit design, hoping to develop a standardized electric conversion kit affordable for the average retired mechanic or hobbyist. The promise was huge: if the battery cells could be made safer, longer-lasting, and cheaper, this project could truly disrupt the auto aftermarket economy. But now, word came that the newest batch of cells had shown unexpected degradation during stress tests. A potentially fatal flaw. Frank tapped out a quick reply, "On my way." At the lab, Janine met him at the door, face tight with concern. "Frank, the cells are failing at a rate that could compromise safety. Thermal runaway risk is higher than we hoped." Frank nodded slowly, already feeling the familiar sting of setback. "Can we fix it?" Janine shook her head. "Maybe. But it means rethinking the chemistry, starting over in some ways. We're talking months, maybe years." Frank clenched his jaw. "How many people are counting on us right now?" Janine's eyes softened. "More than we can count. But none of us expected this journey to be easy." Frank left the lab feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. That night, he sat alone in the dark garage, the Mustang's frame silhouetted by streetlights. He thought about all the people who had trusted this idea, who had begun to believe in second chances. What if he had led them down a dead end? What if this was just a cruel tease from fate? He picked up his phone and opened a recent voicemail from a man named Thomas, 69, from Louisiana. Thomas had written to say the retrofit kit had helped him start a small business electrifying classic cars and buses in his community, providing jobs and hope in a place battered by economic decline. Frank pressed play. Thomas's voice was raw but hopeful. "Frank, I don't know if you'll get this, but thank you. You gave me a reason to get up again. Whatever happens, don't stop." The message hit Frank hard. It wasn't about the Mustang or the tech. It was about people. About legacy. About what happens when one person chooses to fight against invisibility and failure. He realized then that failure was part of the story. Not the end. He called Kyle the next morning. "We're going back to the drawing board," Frank said. "But this time, we're going to build it smarter. Safer. Stronger." Kyle grinned. "That's the Frank I know." Together, they pulled out schematics, videos, and notes from Spark Camp, reaching out to the community for insights and ideas. Elijah helped crowdsource potential battery alternatives from universities and startups around the country. Slowly, a new plan began to form, one that embraced failure as feedback, not finality. Weeks later, during a video call with Janine and the Altair team, Frank found himself quoting Elon Musk again: "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." It felt like permission to breathe, to take risks, to keep pushing even when the path was unclear. And as he looked at the faces on the screen, scientists, engineers, retired workers, everyday people united by a shared mission, Frank understood something he hadn't believed before: age wasn't a limit. Doubt was natural. But hope, courage, and community were the real disruptors. The secret Elon Musk project was never just about a car or a battery. It was about proving that reinvention had no expiration date. That sometimes the greatest disruption comes from those society forgets. That even when doubt creeps back in, the spark can still catch fire, if you don't let go. The breakthrough didn't come from a fancy lab or a Silicon Valley startup. It came from a chat room at midnight, where Frank, Kyle, Elijah, Janine, and a handful of retired engineers and tinkerers hashed out ideas across time zones and coffee cups. One of them, a retired chemist named Gloria from Pittsburgh, suggested a novel battery additive she'd studied decades ago but never applied. It wasn't glamorous, but it promised stability and longevity at a fraction of the cost. Frank felt a jolt of hope so strong it nearly brought him to tears. They called it Project Phoenix, a symbol of rising from ashes and failures past. Overnight, the group mobilized, sourcing raw materials, redesigning battery prototypes, and sharing real-time feedback. Frank's garage became the unofficial headquarters, buzzing again with tools, voices, and laughter. On a brisk Saturday morning, Frank stood in the middle of the workshop, watching a group carefully assemble the first batch of Phoenix cells. Sweat dripped down his forehead despite the chill. He glanced around at faces lit with determination and pride, people decades younger and older, connected by a shared dream. Kyle approached with a grin and handed him a freshly wired battery pack. Ready to test? Frank's hands trembled slightly as he hooked up the pack to the Mustang's conversion system. The hum of electricity filled the air, steady and calm. The gauges held stable, temperature remained cool. It was working. It was working. The entire team erupted in cheers, some whooping, others with tears in their eyes. Frank caught Janine's eye, and she gave him a thumbs up. "We did it," he whispered. But the victory wasn't just technical. It was deeply personal. For Frank, this was proof that even after decades of setbacks and silence, he still had the power to create change, to contribute meaningfully. Word of Project Phoenix spread rapidly through the Altair network and beyond. Suddenly, a new wave of builders and retirees signed up, eager to join a movement that was no longer just about fixing old cars, but about reclaiming their place in the future. Frank's inbox flooded with stories from people who had found renewed purpose, some launching micro-businesses, others mentoring younger generations, all united in a shared belief that age was a chapter, not the end of the story. Kyle started a podcast series featuring these stories, titled Second Acts, which quickly gained traction. One episode featured a former school teacher in Maine who had learned to code and now created apps to help seniors live independently. Another spotlighted a mechanic in Texas who built electric tractors for local farmers. The momentum was undeniable. But with growth came new challenges. Managing a sprawling, decentralized network of makers, builders, and dreamers wasn't easy. Frank found himself torn between wanting to nurture every connection personally and accepting that some things had to grow beyond his control. There were moments of exhaustion, when the weight of expectations threatened to crush him. One afternoon, as rain pelted the garage windows, Frank sat quietly, watching Kyle and Elijah debate a new project management tool on the laptop. Janine came in with a warm cup of tea and sat beside him. "You look tired," she said gently. "I am," he admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I can keep this up." Janine smiled knowingly. "You don't have to do it alone. You've built a community now. That's the power of this project. Lean on them." Frank took a sip and let the warmth settle. She was right. This wasn't his burden anymore, it was theirs. Theirs to share, to shape, to grow. Around that time, a surprising message arrived, an invitation from Tesla itself. Elon Musk's team wanted to visit the workshop, to meet Frank and his crew, to see Project Phoenix in action. The news felt surreal. A lifetime of dreaming in quiet building, now recognized by the very man who had sparked it all. The visit was scheduled for a crisp autumn day. Frank cleaned every inch of the garage, nervously fussing over details while Kyle set up presentations and demos. When Elon arrived, he was exactly as Frank imagined, focused, intense, but approachable. They shook hands, and Elon immediately dove into questions about the battery design, the scalability, the community impact. Frank explained how it wasn't just technology, it was a social revolution, an answer to the invisibility many seniors felt in a world obsessed with youth and speed. Elon listened, nodded, and then shared something that stuck with Frank. Innovation doesn't just happen in labs or boardrooms. It happens in garages, kitchens, and backyards, where passion meets persistence. That's what changes the world. The visit ended with a surprise announcement. Tesla would partner with Altair Labs to help manufacture and distribute Project Phoenix kits at scale, aiming to bring affordable electric conversions to millions across America. Frank felt a mix of pride and responsibility swell inside him. The movement he started in a small garage was about to go nationwide. But he also felt the weight of the journey ahead. Change on this scale wasn't easy. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments when the old doubts would try to creep back in. That night, after Elon's team left, Frank stood alone outside the garage, looking up at the stars. He thought about the boy who once dreamed of fixing engines, the man who felt invisible and broken, and the community now united by a shared spark. The secret Elon Musk project was no longer secret. It was a beacon. And Frank knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. Success, Frank soon discovered, invited scrutiny as much as celebration. As word of Project Phoenix and the growing network of retirees turned innovators spread, so did the voices of doubt and opposition. It started with quiet whispers online, forums filled with skeptics questioning whether a bunch of old-timers could really build anything scalable or safe. Then came articles from industry insiders warning that the technology was too risky, the market too niche, and that what Frank and his community were doing was just a passing fad. One particularly harsh editorial in a national magazine called Project Phoenix a sentimental distraction from real innovation, suggesting that older generations should accept their limits and leave the future to the young. Frank read it in his small Michigan kitchen, the words stinging like a slap. He sat at the table, staring at the page, feeling a familiar surge of frustration and hurt. Was this what he had been fighting against all along? The world telling him and his friends to step aside, to stop dreaming. That night, he called Kyle. "They're attacking everything we stand for," Frank said. "How do we fight that?" Kyle was quiet for a moment. "We don't fight by shouting louder. We fight by showing up. By proving them wrong through action." That's when Frank realized this wasn't just about technology or business anymore. It was about respect, visibility, and the fight for dignity in aging. Over the next few weeks, Frank and his team doubled down on transparency and outreach. They hosted live demonstrations, opened workshops to local communities, and featured stories from everyday people whose lives were changing because of the project. Frank himself began speaking at events, often to skeptical crowds who didn't quite know what to make of a 67-year-old leading a grassroots tech revolution. At one conference in Chicago, he faced a room full of sharp suits and sharper questions. A young venture capitalist challenged him directly. "Mr. Dalton, with all due respect, how do you expect this movement to scale when your core team is, frankly, past the prime age for tech innovation?" The room tensed. Frank smiled calmly. "Innovation has no expiration date. I may be 67, but I've got something the tech world often forgets: experience, resilience, and the wisdom to learn from failure. And I'm surrounded by hundreds of others who feel the same. We are the proof that age is not a barrier to disruption, it's an asset." The room murmured, some impressed, some unconvinced. But Frank held his ground. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Media outlets started sharing human interest stories about retirees building electric cars, launching small businesses, and mentoring younger generations. Testimonials poured in from people who found new purpose and belonging in the project. Even some harsh critics softened when they saw real results: safe, efficient battery kits in use, community workshops thriving, and a growing network of support. Behind the scenes, Frank also faced pressure from the business world. Some potential partners wanted to commercialize the kits quickly, pushing for shortcuts and higher prices. Frank resisted. He knew that to stay true to the mission, Project Phoenix had to remain accessible and community-driven. It wasn't just a product, it was a movement about reclaiming dignity and purpose. In one tense meeting, a corporate executive warned, "If you don't scale fast, someone else will. This market won't wait for sentiment." Frank responded, "If we lose the heart of this project, we lose everything. Growth is important, but not at the expense of the people who make this real." The executive nodded reluctantly, understanding the conviction in Frank's voice. Around this time, Frank also encountered skepticism from his own family. His daughter, Megan, worried about the risks he was taking with his health and time. "Dad, why can't you just relax? You've done enough." Frank looked at her with a tenderness born of years of missed connections. "Because this work matters, Meg. It's bigger than me. It's about proving that we all still matter." Megan hesitated but slowly began to see the passion driving her father. Their conversations grew deeper, more open, healing old wounds. The critics were loud, but Frank found strength in community and family, old and new. One day, a letter arrived from a man named Harold in Ohio, who wrote, "At 72, I built my first electric motorcycle using your kits. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm building a future, not just watching it pass by." Letters like Harold's reminded Frank of the project's true power, not just technology, but transformation. The secret Elon Musk project had sparked something much bigger than batteries and cars. It had ignited a movement of hope, resilience, and reinvention. And despite the critics, Frank was determined to see it through. Just when the critics seemed to grow louder and the road ahead more uncertain, Frank received an unexpected message that would change everything. It was a simple email, subject line reading, "Let's talk." The sender was a name Frank never thought he'd see in his inbox. Vivian Carter, a renowned retired engineer and former executive at a major automotive company. Vivian had been a quiet observer of Project Phoenix, intrigued by the way it was challenging conventions and reshaping how people thought about aging and innovation. She reached out with a mixture of curiosity and respect, offering her expertise and connections to help the movement grow safely and sustainably. Frank stared at the screen, heart pounding. Vivian represented everything the traditional industry stood for: order, precision, and experience, yet here she was, reaching out to a grassroots project led by a man society had long dismissed. He replied cautiously, and soon they arranged a video call. Vivian's voice was warm but firm as she spoke about her admiration for what Frank and his team had built. "I've spent decades in this industry watching it move fast and forget many voices, especially those of older workers and innovators. What you're doing is more than a tech project. It's a social awakening." Frank felt a swell of hope. "I never imagined I'd get support from someone like you." Vivian chuckled softly. "You'd be surprised how many of us are quietly rooting for you." Over the next few weeks, Vivian became a crucial advisor. She helped navigate regulatory hurdles and connected Frank's team with safety experts and quality assurance professionals who could ensure Project Phoenix met the highest standards without compromising accessibility. She also encouraged Frank to document the stories of their community more formally, recognizing the power of narrative in shifting public perception. One afternoon, Frank received a package from Vivian. Inside was a framed photograph of a 1970s assembly line, filled with workers like her younger self, focused, determined, proud. A note read, "Remember where we come from, and where we're going." That moment crystallized something for Frank. This project wasn't just about the future, it was about honoring the past and those who had built the foundation. With Vivian's support, Project Phoenix entered a new phase, one of refinement and expansion. The partnership with Tesla progressed, and plans were laid for pilot programs in several states, focusing on rural communities where economic opportunities had dwindled. Frank found himself traveling more, visiting workshops, meeting with policymakers, and sharing the story of reinvention and resilience. At one event in Kentucky, he met Lucy, a 70-year-old woman who had taught herself 3D printing and was using the technology to create affordable parts for electric bike conversions. Lucy's story mirrored the spirit of Project Phoenix, one of quiet revolution and relentless hope. Frank realized that this network was becoming a tapestry of individual stories woven together by a shared belief, that life after 60 could be vibrant, productive, and full of new beginnings. But even with progress, challenges remained. Funding was tight, media attention fickle, and the daily grind of managing a growing movement exhausting. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Frank sat with Kyle on the porch of the small farmhouse that served as their headquarters. The sun dipped low, casting golden light across the fields. "Do you ever feel like we're just chasing a dream that's too big?" Frank asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Kyle shook his head. No. I see what we've built. The people we've touched. It's real. And dreams that big are the ones worth chasing. Frank smiled, feeling the truth in those words. It wasn't about the destination, but the journey, and the people who traveled it with him. As word spread of Vivian's involvement, public perception began to shift. Industry leaders who once dismissed Project Phoenix started attending workshops, asking questions, even volunteering their expertise. It became clear that the movement was no longer fringe, it was a catalyst for change in an economy desperate for innovation and inclusivity. One day, Frank received a call from a young journalist named Maya, eager to tell the full story of Project Phoenix, not just the technology, but the human spirit behind it. The resulting feature piece painted a vivid picture of retirees refusing to fade away, instead rising to lead a quiet revolution that was disrupting industries and challenging ageism. The article went viral, sparking conversations across social media, TV shows, and community centers nationwide. For Frank, this was another validation that the spark Elon Musk had ignited was now a wildfire fueled by thousands of voices. Yet, amidst the growing success, Frank never forgot the early days, the loneliness, the doubt, the sense of invisibility. He carried those memories as fuel to keep pushing, knowing that for many, this project represented hope and the chance to reclaim their story. One quiet night, as he updated the community newsletter, Frank reflected on how far they had come. The secret Elon Musk project was no longer secret. It had become a beacon for those who refused to be sidelined by age or circumstance. And with allies like Vivian, and a community united by purpose, the future looked brighter than ever. Frank knew the road ahead would have more hurdles, more skeptics, and more moments of uncertainty. But now he was ready. Because he wasn't alone anymore. Together, they were building not just a project, but a legacy. Frank's mornings had taken on a new rhythm, not unlike the steady hum of the electric engines he and his team built. Yet, beneath the surface of progress, he felt a restlessness, a quiet whisper that change was needed not just in the technology, but within himself and the culture surrounding Project Phoenix. It wasn't enough to convert old cars or teach retirees new skills. The bigger battle was against deeply ingrained habits and mindsets that told people they were too old, too tired, or too set in their ways. One crisp morning, after a community workshop in upstate New York, Frank sat alone on the tailgate of his truck, watching the sun rise over rolling hills dotted with changing leaves. He thought about the conversations from the day, stories of frustration, of missed opportunities, and the fear of failure that kept many from even trying. Frank realized that if the movement was going to truly disrupt the economy, it had to break these old mental patterns. He remembered something Elon Musk had said in a recent interview: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. That phrase echoed in his mind. What if that same mindset could be passed to every member of their community? Frank decided to launch a new initiative within Project Phoenix, called Breakthrough Mindsets. It was designed not just to teach technical skills, but to reshape the way people saw themselves, age be damned. The first session was in a small community center in Ohio, packed with retirees skeptical but curious. Frank shared his own story, vulnerabilities and all, the regrets, the failures, and the moment he realized he had the power to change. Then he introduced exercises designed to challenge self-limiting beliefs, writing down fears, identifying false narratives, and replacing them with affirmations of capability and purpose. At first, the room was quiet, but as the session went on, people began to open up. Stories emerged. Of a woman who had always dreamed of starting a bakery but never believed she could, of a man who gave up on painting after retirement but was now considering reopening his old studio. The energy shifted palpably. Frank felt a surge of hope. He knew this was the missing piece. Technical knowledge was vital, but the internal revolution was what would sustain the movement. As breakthrough mindsets spread, so did the transformation. People started small, taking daily walks, signing up for classes, reaching out to old friends. The changes were subtle but powerful, rippling out through families and communities. Back in Michigan, Frank noticed a change in himself too. He was less burdened by fear and more energized by possibility. He began journaling regularly, a practice he once thought was pointless. Each entry reaffirmed his commitment to growth and resilience. Yet breaking old patterns wasn't easy. There were setbacks and relapses. Some members struggled with depression, health issues, or discouragement when progress stalled. Frank and the team learned to listen deeply, offering support without judgment. They built peer mentoring networks where members could share challenges and celebrate victories. One memorable moment came during a virtual call when Harold, the 72-year-old from Ohio, shared that he had finally reconnected with his estranged son after years of silence. The room erupted in applause. Frank realized that the true disruption wasn't just in batteries or cars, but in human connection and healing. Meanwhile, media began to catch on to this deeper story. Documentaries and podcasts featured not only the technical innovation but the emotional journeys of transformation. The narrative was shifting from, "Can old people innovate?" to, "How can we unlock the potential of all ages?" Yet, as the movement grew, so did external pressures. A major automaker released a competing electric conversion kit, heavily marketed and backed by deep pockets. Frank worried this could overshadow their grassroots project. But instead of panicking, he saw an opportunity to emphasize Project Phoenix's heart and authenticity, qualities no corporate machine could replicate. Frank's team doubled down on storytelling, community engagement, and transparency. They invited the public into their workshops, encouraged open-source sharing, and celebrated every small victory publicly. This openness won trust and loyalty from people who craved authenticity in an age of slick advertising. Frank also reconnected with Megan, his daughter, who had begun volunteering to help manage social media and outreach. Their relationship, once strained, was now a source of strength. They brainstormed together ways to highlight the movement's emotional core, turning Project Phoenix from a technical solution into a symbol of resilience and renewal. One evening, Megan surprised Frank with a short video compilation of testimonials from participants, laughing, working, sharing stories of rediscovered purpose. Watching it, Frank felt tears blur his vision. The secret Elon Musk project was no longer just about disruption, it was about transformation on every level. As autumn deepened, Frank prepared for a national summit, where members from across the country would gather to share innovations, stories, and strategies for growth. The energy was electric, hundreds of people, young and old, united by a common mission to redefine what it meant to age and innovate. On the eve of the summit, Frank stood outside the venue, gazing at the city skyline glittering under a starry sky. He thought about the journey, the moments of doubt, the fierce hope, the community that had risen up from quiet garages and kitchen tables. He remembered Elon's words about doing what mattered despite the odds, and he smiled. Frank realized the biggest breakthrough wasn't the technology or the partnership with Tesla, it was breaking free from the chains of limiting beliefs and opening the door to a future where everyone's potential mattered, no matter their age. The secret Elon Musk project had ignited a revolution not just in energy, but in spirit. And this revolution was just getting started. The day of the national summit arrived with a crisp chill in the air, but inside the grand hall, the atmosphere buzzed with warmth, hope, and anticipation. Frank stood by the entrance, watching as participants poured in, retirees, engineers, dreamers, skeptics turned believers, all gathered under one roof to celebrate what had begun as a small spark inspired by Elon Musk's relentless spirit. It was the moment when everything could change or crumble. The event was designed not just to showcase technology but to create a movement, a tipping point where age, innovation, and purpose collided to rewrite the rules of the economy. The morning sessions were filled with presentations of new electric prototypes, workshops on sustainability, and heartfelt testimonials from participants who had reclaimed their sense of self through Project Phoenix. Frank moved through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging stories, feeling the electric current of possibility pulsing through the room. In the back, a group of young entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley mingled, some skeptical but visibly moved by the energy and commitment of the older innovators. During lunch, Frank sat down with Vivian and Kyle, who had both become pillars of the project. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Vivian asked, her eyes shining with pride. Kyle grinned. "Feels like we're standing on the edge of something huge." Frank nodded but felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He knew that real change would require more than passion, it needed to overcome entrenched economic and societal barriers. After lunch, Frank took the stage to deliver the keynote. The hall fell silent as he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. What started as a small idea to help people reclaim purpose has grown into a movement that challenges every assumption about aging, innovation, and value. We are proving that no one is too old to change the economy, to build the future, to lead. He shared stories of Harold from Ohio, Lucy from Kentucky, and others who had transformed their lives and communities. The crowd responded with applause, some wiping tears, others nodding with newfound resolve. Then Frank unveiled the next phase of Project Phoenix, a nationwide network connecting retirees with startups, educational resources, and funding opportunities. This hybrid model aimed to blend experience with fresh ideas, creating a multi-generational force that could disrupt industries from energy to manufacturing to healthcare. The proposal was met with a standing ovation. After the speech, a flurry of media interviews and networking followed. Frank found himself surrounded by reporters eager to capture the essence of this unexpected revolution. A young journalist asked, "Frank, what do you say to those who still doubt that people over 60 can lead technological change?" Frank smiled. "I say look around. We're not just leading change, we're reshaping the economy because we refuse to accept limits others place on us." That night, at a gala dinner, Frank was approached by a woman named Elena, a policy advisor from Washington, D.C. She had been following Project Phoenix closely and was impressed by its impact and potential. "There's interest here in exploring ways to support your work through legislation and funding," Elena said. "But it will take advocacy and continued proof of success to make it happen." Frank felt a surge of hope mixed with the daunting reality of navigating bureaucracy. Still, this was progress. Over the next months, Project Phoenix's network expanded rapidly. Local governments, nonprofits, and private companies began partnering to create incentives for retiree entrepreneurs. The media spotlight intensified, shining a light on stories of resilience, creativity, and intergenerational collaboration. However, with growth came new challenges. Some participants struggled to keep pace with technological advances or faced health setbacks. Others wrestled with the pressure to monetize their ideas quickly, risking burnout or compromise of the project's core values. Frank and his team worked tirelessly to provide support, counseling, and flexible learning programs to keep the community strong and resilient. One particularly emotional moment came when a longtime member named Joe, 75, who had battled chronic illness, unveiled a prototype for a low-cost solar battery designed for rural areas. His tears of pride and gratitude reminded everyone that the movement was about much more than profits, it was about dignity and hope. Meanwhile, Frank's relationship with Megan deepened as they co-led outreach campaigns that bridged generations. Megan's youthful energy and tech-savvy complemented Frank's wisdom and empathy, embodying the movement's multi-generational spirit. One afternoon, as they worked late into the evening, Megan turned to Frank. "Dad, I think this is more than a project now. It's a legacy. Something that will outlive us." Frank smiled, feeling a profound sense of purpose. Yet, even at this high point, Frank knew the work was far from over. The economy was vast and complex, and shifting decades-old biases and systems would take time. But the tipping point had been reached. A movement born from the spark of a secret Elon Musk project was now a force transforming the economy, empowering older Americans, and inspiring the world. Frank closed his eyes and whispered, "We're just getting started." The rising momentum of Project Phoenix was undeniable, but with it came the inevitable storm, criticism, pushback, and unforeseen challenges that tested Frank and the community's resolve. It began subtly at first, snide headlines in local newspapers dismissing the movement as a fleeting trend of tech hobbyists or retirees playing with gadgets. Then came the skeptical voices from industry insiders warning that mixing aging workers with high-tech innovation was risky and impractical. The tension mounted when a major political figure publicly questioned the viability of allocating public funds to a project led by seniors instead of investing in younger entrepreneurs. Frank read the comments with a heavy heart. It stung, not because he doubted the criticism, but because it echoed the very prejudices Project Phoenix was fighting to overcome. But Frank was no stranger to adversity. He recalled Elon Musk's relentless drive to challenge the status quo despite countless naysayers and near disasters. That same spirit steeled him for the battle ahead. Instead of retreating, Frank and the team decided to face the storm head-on. They organized a series of public forums and town halls designed to address concerns transparently and invite dialogue. They brought in experts, economists, gerontologists, technologists, to share data and stories demonstrating how age diversity was not a liability, but a critical asset to innovation. The forums were intense. Voices clashed, frustrations surfaced, but gradually, a new narrative began to emerge, one of mutual respect and shared hope. Frank was particularly moved during one session when an elderly woman from a rural town described how Project Phoenix had given her the tools to start a business crafting eco-friendly furniture, reviving her small community's economy. Her story cut through skepticism like a knife. Meanwhile, within the community, not everyone weathered the storm easily. Some participants questioned whether the movement could sustain itself amid growing criticism and financial pressures. Others felt overwhelmed by the expectations placed on them to perform or prove value in a fast-paced, youth-obsessed market. Frank recognized the signs of fatigue and burnout. He increased efforts to provide mental health support, peer counseling, and flexible participation options that honored individual capacity and pacing. The core message was clear: transformation was a marathon, not a sprint. One pivotal moment came when a major corporate sponsor unexpectedly withdrew funding, citing strategic realignment. The blow threatened to derail a key pilot program in the Midwest. Frank convened an emergency meeting with Vivian, Kyle, and Megan. The mood was grim, but ideas flowed. They launched a grassroots crowdfunding campaign, leveraging the emotional connection their community had built. The response was overwhelming. Small donations poured in from people inspired by the project's mission, proving that collective belief could overcome institutional setbacks. Around this time, Frank also faced personal trials. His health, though stable, reminded him of its fragility, and moments of exhaustion tested his resolve. Yet, messages from community members who credited Project Phoenix with saving their sense of purpose fueled his determination. He found solace in daily rituals, morning walks, journaling, and late-night talks with Megan, that recharged his spirit. Throughout the storm, Elon Musk's indirect presence remained a guiding light. Frank often replayed Musk's interviews in his mind, especially those about resilience and the refusal to be defined by age or failure. He even incorporated Musk's philosophies into Breakthrough Mindsets workshops, emphasizing that the greatest innovations often come from those willing to face discomfort and uncertainty head-on. As months passed, the storm began to clear. Public opinion shifted as success stories multiplied and data showed the economic benefits of Project Phoenix's model. Policymakers who had once been skeptical started attending events, exploring ways to support the movement through legislation and grants. A notable breakthrough came when a bipartisan bill was introduced to fund multigenerational innovation hubs, inspired directly by Project Phoenix's model. Frank was invited to testify before Congress, a moment he never imagined in his wildest dreams. Standing before lawmakers, Frank spoke not just about technology but about dignity, purpose, and the power of community. He urged them to see aging not as a problem but as an opportunity to harness untapped wisdom and creativity. His words resonated, earning nods and applause. The hearing marked a turning point, signaling official recognition that Project Phoenix was more than an experiment, it was a blueprint for a new economic paradigm. Back home, the community celebrated with renewed vigor. New members joined from across the country, eager to participate and contribute. The once dismissive media now sought Frank's perspective, often framing Project Phoenix as a national model for innovation and inclusivity. Yet, Frank remained grounded. He knew the storm had tested them, but the real work was ongoing, building sustainable systems, nurturing relationships, and continually challenging limiting beliefs. On a quiet evening, Frank stood by his workshop window, looking out at the twilight sky. He felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with cautious optimism. The secret Elon Musk project had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, a testament to the power of resilience and community. Frank whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." In the months following the political breakthrough, Project Phoenix evolved into more than just a technical innovation. It blossomed into a vibrant community, a network where connection became the true catalyst for transformation. Frank noticed this power of connection most vividly during one late spring afternoon at the newly established Innovation Hub in Detroit. The space was alive with energy, retirees collaborating with young engineers, artists sharing ideas with entrepreneurs, and educators mentoring those hungry to learn. It was a hub that defied stereotypes, where age was a bridge rather than a barrier. Frank walked through the open workshop, listening to conversations filled with excitement and curiosity. He paused near a table where Evelyn, a 68-year-old former schoolteacher, animatedly explained the basics of coding to Marcus, a 24-year-old software developer who had recently joined the project after losing his job in the tech shakeup. Their unlikely friendship was a testament to what Project Phoenix was building, intergenerational partnerships that brought out the best in everyone. Frank reflected on how Elon Musk's example had ignited this vision, the audacity to imagine a future where collaboration transcended age, experience, and background. It was a vision that now pulsed through every corner of the movement. One of the most inspiring stories came from Linda, a 72-year-old widow from Ohio, who had always dreamed of writing but never found the courage. With encouragement from the community, she launched a podcast highlighting stories of resilience among older Americans. Her project quickly gained traction, connecting listeners nationwide and inspiring others to share their voices. Linda's success was a reminder that connection was more than physical proximity, it was the exchange of stories, the validation of shared struggles, and the celebration of collective strength. Social media had become a powerful tool in amplifying these connections. Megan, now a lead coordinator for Project Phoenix's digital outreach, curated content that celebrated small wins, breakthrough moments, and daily acts of courage. Her posts sparked conversations and created virtual spaces where members who couldn't attend in person still felt deeply part of the movement. Frank watched as online forums buzzed with encouragement and advice, proving that distance was no obstacle to community. Yet, connection wasn't always easy. Frank saw moments of tension, generational misunderstandings, and clashes of perspective. At one meeting, a debate erupted between younger volunteers eager to push rapid innovation and older members urging caution and reflection. Frank stepped in, reminding everyone that connection required listening as much as speaking, patience as much as urgency. He encouraged the group to embrace their differences as strengths rather than divisions. Over time, these challenging conversations deepened understanding and forged stronger bonds. The community became a living example of empathy in action. Outside the Innovation Hub, connections extended into neighborhoods and homes. Retirees formed walking groups, cooking clubs, and local advocacy teams. They hosted events that brought diverse generations together, block parties, storytelling nights, and skill-sharing workshops. These grassroots connections created ripples beyond technology, healing the isolation and loneliness that often shadowed aging. Frank received letters and messages from participants who spoke of newfound friendships, restored confidence, and a rekindled sense of belonging. One letter from a man named Sam, 69, stood out. "Before Project Phoenix, I felt invisible. Now, I'm part of something bigger than myself, a community that sees me, hears me, and believes in me. That has changed everything." Frank knew that these connections were the true secret behind the project's impact. Technology and innovation were tools, but human connection was the fuel that powered transformation. Elon Musk's relentless push to connect people through technology now found its most profound expression in these human networks. As the year progressed, Frank and Meghan worked to expand the model internationally, connecting with communities in Canada, Europe, and Australia. They shared lessons learned and adapted programs to honor cultural differences while preserving the core message. No one was ever too old to connect, create, and contribute. The movement grew into a global family, bound by shared values of resilience, innovation, and hope. One unforgettable moment came during a virtual global summit, where participants from multiple continents shared their stories in a live video conference. The screen lit up with faces young and old, smiling, laughing, and sometimes wiping tears. Frank felt a lump in his throat as he realized how far the secret Elon Musk project had come, from a small idea in a lonely workshop to a worldwide wave of connection and possibility. But even as the community thrived, Frank remained vigilant. He knew that connection required constant nurturing and intentionality. He championed ongoing training for empathy, communication, and conflict resolution, ensuring that Project Phoenix remained a safe and welcoming space for all. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Frank and Meghan sat on the porch of his home, watching fireflies dance in the dusk. Meghan turned to her father and said, "You know, Dad, the power of connection is the real disruption. It's not just about technology or economy, it's about how we see each other." Frank nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. Elon showed us how to dream big, but we've learned how to live those dreams through each other. As the fireflies flickered around them, Frank understood that the secret project's greatest achievement was not the inventions or the policies, but the web of human connection that would sustain a new economy, one built on respect, collaboration, and endless possibility. The revolution was alive, and it was carried forward on the wings of connection. Frank woke to the soft glow of morning light filtering through his curtains, the familiar creaks of his old house greeting him like old friends. The world outside was stirring, but inside his mind, a quiet revolution was unfolding. After years of battling doubt, skepticism, and the weight of time, he was beginning to understand something fundamental. Purpose wasn't something fixed or lost, it was something to be reimagined again and again. The journey that had started as a simple attempt to reclaim relevance in a world that seemed to leave him behind had transformed into a vast movement redefining what it meant to grow old. Sitting at his kitchen table, sipping coffee, Frank reflected on how many in his generation had been conditioned to believe that aging meant fading into the background, retreating from dreams, ambitions, and the bright pulse of life. But through Project Phoenix, inspired by the fearless mindset of Elon Musk, they were proving those assumptions wrong every single day. Purpose wasn't about clinging to the past or trying to relive youth, it was about embracing change, carving new paths, and daring to imagine what life could be at any age. This shift in mindset was the true engine behind their transformation. Frank remembered a conversation he had recently with Ruth, a 70-year-old artist who had once abandoned painting after decades. With gentle encouragement from the community, Ruth had picked up her brushes again and even hosted a gallery showing that drew crowds and praise. When Frank asked her what had changed, she simply said, "I realized I wasn't too old to start over. I just needed permission, from myself." This permission to reinvent, to let go of limiting beliefs and societal expectations, was the essence of Project Phoenix's impact. Frank felt a surge of pride knowing that the movement had helped countless people grant themselves that same freedom. The reimagining of purpose extended beyond individual stories. Communities transformed as well. Small towns once struggling with economic decline saw retirees launching startups, social enterprises, and creative hubs that revitalized local economies. Schools partnered with senior innovators to provide mentorship programs, enriching education with decades of experience. Healthcare providers incorporated wellness programs that integrated purposeful activity, recognizing its profound effect on mental and physical health. Frank understood that purpose was deeply intertwined with contribution. The ability to give back, to create, to shape the future. Elon Musk's audacity had shown that bold visions could upend entire industries. Project Phoenix took that lesson to heart, proving that such visions didn't belong exclusively to the young or the famous, but were accessible to anyone willing to push boundaries and believe in their potential. At a recent community retreat, Frank listened as participants shared how their new sense of purpose rippled through their families and friendships, healing old wounds and forging stronger connections. He himself had experienced this healing, especially in his relationship with Megan. Their shared commitment to the project had deepened their bond beyond words. One afternoon, as they walked through the Innovation Hub's garden, Megan stopped and said, "Dad, I see you differently now, not just as a parent, but as someone who's still creating, still dreaming." Frank smiled, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. The reimagining of purpose also challenged cultural narratives about productivity and worth. Frank had watched older members grapple with internalized messages that their best days were behind them, that their contributions were no longer needed or valued. Project Phoenix's ethos confronted these lies head-on, celebrating every act of creativity, resilience, and leadership as vital to the collective future. This cultural shift wasn't easy or linear. There were moments of doubt, frustration, and grief for what had been lost. But through the support of community and the guiding light of innovation, participants found ways to honor their histories while embracing new chapters. Frank's own reflections deepened during quiet evenings when he journaled about his hopes for the future. He wrote about a world where aging was not feared but welcomed, where every person could reinvent their purpose, and where society valued wisdom alongside innovation. This vision felt attainable now, no longer a distant dream but a tangible possibility. The secret Elon Musk project had sparked more than technological breakthroughs, it had ignited a movement that redefined human potential at every stage of life. Frank knew there was still much work to be done. Systems needed to adapt, stereotypes needed to be dismantled, and opportunities expanded. But the foundation was strong, built on the courage to reimagine purpose and the power of community to sustain change. One evening, at a gathering to celebrate the 5th anniversary of Project Phoenix, Frank took the stage to share his vision. His voice carried the weight of experience and the spark of hope. "Purpose is not something we find once and for all," he said. "It is something we create, recreate, and live every day. Age is not a barrier, it is a gateway to new beginnings, new dreams, and new impact. We are proof that it's never too late to matter, to build, to inspire." The crowd rose in a standing ovation, many wiping tears, others beaming with renewed resolve. Frank looked out at the faces illuminated by the soft glow of stage lights, faces that had weathered storms, broken through barriers, and now stood united in a shared mission. As the applause washed over him, Frank felt a deep certainty settle in his heart. The secret Elon Musk project had become more than a catalyst for economic change. It was a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever doubted their worth, a reminder that purpose was a living, breathing force waiting to be discovered anew. The revolution was not just about disrupting industries, it was about disrupting mindsets. And that, Frank knew, was the greatest disruption of all. Frank sat quietly in his workshop late into the night, the soft hum of the city outside barely penetrating the stillness inside. Around him lay the tools and inventions born of countless hours of perseverance, hope, and transformation. This space, once a symbol of forgotten dreams and stalled ambitions, had become the crucible where a new legacy was forged, not just for him, but for an entire generation long dismissed by society. As he traced his fingers over the smooth surface of a prototype device that had taken months to perfect, Frank's thoughts drifted back to the beginning of this journey, when he first stumbled upon Elon Musk's words that shook the foundation of his beliefs. The boldness, the fearlessness, and the refusal to accept limitations had lit a spark inside him. That spark had grown into a fire, one that now illuminated a path not only for Frank but for thousands of others rediscovering their capacity to impact the world. Frank's own legacy had been transformed, from one shadowed by regret and missed opportunities to one bursting with renewed purpose and tangible contributions. He realized legacy was not simply what you left behind but what you chose to build every day, how you showed up, the lives you touched, and the stories you helped write. Around him, the Project Phoenix community was a living testament to this truth. Many had started with the same fears Frank knew so well, that time had passed, that doors had closed, that their best days were behind them. Yet, one by one, they shattered those illusions. From entrepreneurs launching startups in their 70s to artists debuting new work decades after retirement, the community embodied a renaissance of possibility. Frank recalled Mary, a former accountant who, after years of silence, began speaking publicly about financial literacy for seniors, empowering countless others to take control of their futures. There was also Carlos, a 75-year-old mechanic who, inspired by Project Phoenix's innovation labs, developed an eco-friendly engine prototype that caught the attention of major manufacturers. Their stories intertwined with Frank's, weaving a tapestry of resilience and reinvention. As the movement grew, so did its influence. Governments and corporations alike began to recognize the value of engaging older adults as vital contributors rather than liabilities. Policies shifted toward inclusive innovation, workforce participation, and lifelong learning. Educational institutions redesigned curricula to foster multigenerational collaboration. Economic forecasts projected growth fueled by untapped wisdom and experience. These changes, once unimaginable, were now becoming reality. But for Frank, legacy was more than public recognition or policy wins, it was deeply personal. He thought of Megan, whose unwavering belief had carried him through moments of doubt. Their relationship, once strained by years of distance, had blossomed into a partnership rooted in mutual respect and shared dreams. Together, they envisioned a future where every person could write their own story, regardless of age. One evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over the city skyline, Megan turned to Frank and said, "Dad, what you've built isn't just a project, it's a movement that will outlive us both." Frank smiled, feeling a swell of emotion. "It's a legacy reborn," he replied softly. The secret Elon Musk project had not only disrupted the economy, it had disrupted the very notion of what legacy meant for their generation. It was a legacy defined by courage, connection, and the relentless pursuit of possibility. As Frank prepared to share the next phase of Project Phoenix with the world, a plan to create a global network of intergenerational innovation centers, he felt a profound sense of peace. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but every step had been worth it. Because in the end, legacy wasn't about the years behind but the impact ahead. And that impact, Frank knew, was limitless. The day dawned crisp and clear, a fresh breeze carrying the scent of possibility as Frank stepped onto the stage at the Global Project Phoenix Summit. The auditorium was filled to capacity, a sea of faces glowing with anticipation and hope. This wasn't just a conference. It was a celebration of transformation, resilience, and the undeniable power of reinvention. Years ago, Frank would have never imagined standing here, surrounded by innovators, advocates, and dreamers spanning generations and continents. The secret Elon Musk project that had sparked his own personal journey had blossomed into a worldwide movement, disrupting not only economies but also hearts and minds. As he gazed across the crowd, Frank felt the weight of history and the lightness of new beginnings entwined. He began to speak, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "We are gathered here today not just to witness change, but to be the change. To declare that age is not a barrier, but a gateway to opportunity. That the wisdom of experience combined with the fire of innovation can reshape our world in ways once thought impossible." The audience erupted in applause, a chorus of voices affirming a shared belief that nothing was set in stone, not even what it meant to grow old. Frank's story had become a beacon for millions who felt invisible, forgotten, or too old to change. And yet, the message was simple: it's never too late to begin again. Behind him, giant screens displayed images of Project Phoenix hubs bustling with activity, retirees coding side by side with young engineers, artists teaching crafts to eager learners, families reunited through technology and empathy. Each picture told a story of hope rekindled and lives transformed. Frank shared his own journey, the moments of doubt, the fierce battles against skepticism, the victories both small and monumental. He spoke candidly about the influence of Elon Musk's fearless mindset, not as a savior but as a spark that ignited a fire within countless ordinary people daring to defy limitations. The secret, Frank said, was never about technology alone. It was about belief, the belief that we matter, that our ideas matter, that our time is now. As he concluded, the crowd rose, their applause thunderous and sustained. Frank looked out and saw not just supporters, but co-creators of a new era. After the speech, Frank was approached by attendees from across the globe, young and old, from diverse backgrounds, all eager to share their stories and their visions. He listened intently, feeling the ripple effect of the movement extending far beyond what he had imagined. Later, as the summit wound down, Frank found a quiet moment on a balcony overlooking the city. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Megan joined him, her eyes shining with pride and hope. "Dad," she said softly, "this is just the beginning. What started as a spark in your garage has become a wildfire of change." Frank nodded, the weight of the journey settling comfortably in his heart. "And it's a fire that will keep burning, as long as people keep believing in themselves and each other." They stood together in silence, the city lights twinkling below like stars brought down to earth. In that moment, Frank realized that the secret Elon Musk project was more than a disruption of the economy, it was a revolution of the human spirit. A call to every person who had ever felt too old, too small, or too late to matter. The revolution was now, and it belonged to all of them. As the night deepened, Frank returned inside to the hum of conversations and laughter, a community alive with possibility and purpose. He smiled, knowing that his own story was intertwined with theirs, that the legacy he once feared was lost had been reborn as a testament to courage, connection, and relentless hope. The future stretched out before him, unknown, challenging, and dazzlingly bright. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt ready to run toward it. The secret Elon Musk project had shown him, and countless others, that the end is never really the end. It's the doorway to a new beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?